The month I turned 32, I found a blood-slick handprint on the dock rail, where only my own hand had rested for years. Before that month ended, a tall forest being sat at the far end of those same planks every evening and shared the sunset hour I had kept for my sister Nora since she drowned in Blackwater's spring pool. It did not heal me clean, and it did not give anything back, but it sat long enough that grief stopped taking up the whole shoreline. I came back to my father's cedar cabin 3 weeks after I walked out of St. Anne's in Seattle and handed my badge to a night supervisor who did not ask me to reconsider. I had worked med-surg for 8 years. I knew how to move fast, how to chart cleanly, how to hold pressure on a wound and keep my voice level while families fell apart in hallways. After Nora died, every hospital corridor felt narrow, and every monitor alarm came through my chest like a nail. I started standing in supply closets just to breathe. By the end of February, I was driving east with 2 duffel bags, Scout in the passenger seat, and a box of Nora's brushes in the back where groceries used to ride. The cabin sat above Blackwater Lake on a low rise of root and rock, tucked inside red cedar and western hemlock. My father had built it in sections over 12 years, then died of a winter stroke before he could finish the second shed. I knew every board he set because Nora and I sanded most of them on summer breaks when we were kids. Palms raw, sawdust in our hair, radio on the windowsill with the weather report crackling in and out. The place smelled like old smoke and wet timber, even when no fire burned. No neighbors were close enough for porch lights to matter. If I stood at the dock at dusk and looked south, all I saw was dark tree line and the long shine of water under wind. I made the first week simple on purpose. Rise before light, split alder, and stack it under the eave. Check the rowboat knot twice and pull the stern line tighter if the night wind had shifted. Feed Scout from the metal tub near the stove. Put coffee in the blackened kettle. Mend net floats by the window while morning rain moved across the lake in bands. Sweep needles off the dock. Scrape moss from planks Nora used to prime with cheap gesso before painting reeds and cloud edges she never sold and never framed. By the second week of March, that sequence held me together better than sleep did. Scout was 14 and stiff in the hips, half lab and half something broad-chested and patient. He had gone grey around the muzzle in the year Nora died. He ate slowly now, one side of his jaw weaker than the other, and he climbed the dock with care when it rained, nails clicking soft on wet boards. At night, he slept on the braided rug by the wood stove and snored in short, uneven bursts. If I woke from one of the lake dreams, I listened for that sound first. If I heard it, I could stand down. I talked to him more than I talked to anyone else. "You and me, old man," I told him one morning while I worked pitch out of a knot with a putty knife. "You guard the house. I will keep the fire going." He thumped his tail once against the floorboards and closed his eyes. Most evenings I carried 2 enamel mugs to the dock. Out of habit, I never corrected. One held coffee for me. The other stayed full and cooled untouched beside my left knee. Nora had always wanted one more cup no matter the hour, no matter the weather. She painted best in the low light, when the lake turned from silver to pewter, and birds shifted places before settling down. She tapped the dock twice with the butt of her brush before she packed up, always twice like a sign-off to somebody she trusted to hear it. After her canoe went over in spring undertow 2 years earlier, I kept setting out that second mug because stopping felt like a second burial. Blackwater looked calm from shore most days. That was the danger my father used to name in plain terms. The upper surface moved easy, almost lazy, but a cold undercurrent ran along the old river cut beneath the dock and out toward the east narrows. In breakup season, when meltwater came down hard from the ridges, that underpull could snatch a loose boat line and drag it below before you finished cursing. It took Nora's canoe broadside when she reached to free a snag near the reeds. No storm, no warning, just one narrow mistake, and a current with no patience. I pinned weather maps and current notes to the wall by the pantry where my father used to keep trapping permits. I marked wind direction in pencil each morning. I checked rain totals at supper. I treated the lake like a patient with a history I could not ignore. The world stayed ordinary long enough that every change showed itself clean. It started with Scout facing the trees at dusk and holding still. He did not bark, he did not run. He just stood near the top of the dock ramp, ears forward, chest set, staring into cedar shadow along the north bank as if he heard a footstep the rest of us missed. The first time, I chalked it up to raccoon movement. The second time, I watched with him. Nothing came out. The third time, he gave one low sound in his throat and pressed against my leg until my coffee cooled in my hand. 2 mornings later, I found 3 trout missing from the covered pail behind the smokehouse. The latch was still down. The lid sat true. No claw marks on wood, no scattered scales. Just empty space where fish had been and a clean, wet ring on the plank beside it, like something had rested there briefly and moved on. That same day, I noticed prints beside my boot tracks on the mud path that ran from dock to woodpile. They were broad at the forefoot, deeper at the heel, and too long for any boot I owned. Not bear, not cat, not elk. The stride sat narrower than elk and more deliberate than bear. Each impression held water that reflected a strip of pale sky. I crouched with my hand over one and felt, for the first time in months, a kind of a tension in my own body that was not grief and not fear, just a tension. I considered calling the county office. I had done it once after Nora died, for paperwork and retrieval reports and all the forms that turn a life into date fields and signatures. I still had the deputy's card in a jar with spare screws on the shelf by the sink. That evening I carried it outside, read the number, then set it back in the jar and left it there. I did not have facts worth anybody's fuel and time. I had odd prints, missing fish, and a dog who stared into trees. Still, I changed habits. I kept the bolt action by the door but stopped bringing it to the dock. I moved slower at dusk. I listened before I stepped on the planks. I set my left boot where Nora once set hers and tested each board before I trusted it with my weight. Scout stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed my calf every few minutes, a small contact that told me he was tracking something beyond me and had not decided it was a threat. By the 3rd week of March, the lake birds began lifting early from the far reeds. Every evening, 10 minutes before full dusk, the same pocket of coots and teal went up together and crossed west in one tight line. Not startled, not frantic, just leaving as if making room for something with mass. The reeds rocked after they left. Then they went still. Wind did not explain it. Current did not explain it. I marked times in a notebook and watched the pattern hold for 5 nights in a row. On the 6th evening, rain held off and the air sat heavy. No wind at all, only the soft lick of water against pilings and the low hiss of stove smoke from my flue behind me. I carried 2 mugs out like always and settled at the middle board where the knots made a rough oval under my palm. Scout lay down across the ramp, head up, eyes on the north tree line. The light flattened across the cove until every cedar trunk looked inked in charcoal. I remember the exact moment, because Scout's breathing changed first. One deep breath, then a pause, then a shorter pull through his nose. "Easy," I said to him, not taking my eyes off the water. "We stay put." He did not move. I sat there until the mugs cooled and dusk thickened. and I felt the old ache rise and spread in its familiar shape from sternum to throat, the one that usually sent me back inside before full dark. I stayed anyway. I listened to reeds settling and distant wing beats and my own pulse in my ears. The lake gave me nothing back except its surface and the long dark under it. When I stood to leave, my hand slid on the right rail. I looked down and saw a fresh smear of red across the cedar top, narrow at one end, broad at the heel of the mark, with long finger lines dragged toward the water, as if something wounded had gripped for balance. The print was too large for mine, too long for any glove I owned. Wet, not yet tacky. New. Scout rose without a sound and came to my side. He sniffed once, then faced the trees again, and waited. I eased my hand away from the rail and held it up in the last of the light. The smear on my palm was thin and dark, and the iron smell was plain even over wet cedar. I set my mug down on the middle plank, reached into my jacket for the small penlight I kept for the woodshed fuse box, and angled the beam across the mark. 5 finger trails, a broad heel, the drag line toward open water. "Stay close," I said. Scout moved half a step in and leaned against my knee. His back was warm through my work pants. He did not growl. He watched the north trees and breathed through his nose in short pulls. I did what years on a hospital floor had trained me to do when my pulse rose. I made a sequence and followed it. I went up the ramp without turning my back to the tree line, got the tackle box from under the sink, and brought down the cloth tape I used for net repair, 2 zip bags and a clean rag. I measured the print against the rail edge and wrote the number in my pocket notebook. By flashlight, 9 3/4 inches from top of finger, drag to heel smear, wider than my open hand by nearly half. I wiped only the outer streak where it had touched my skin, folded the rag in on itself, and sealed it. I left the main print intact. When I finished, night had settled flat over the cove. The water went black except where the dock lamp threw a weak yellow stripe. I turned that lamp off, stood still, and listened. No paddle knock, no branch break, no splash from heavy movement. Just the low brush of current under the planks and one owl farther upslope. Inside, I locked the door, set the bagged rag in the old enamel bread tin with spare batteries, and wrote the time beside the measurement. Scout drank, circled once on the rug, and lay down with his head on his paws, but his eyes open. I sat at the table with my hands around a reheated mug and looked at the current chart nailed to the pantry wall until the pencil marks blurred. The line I had drawn for undertow days in red wax pencil ran across the whole week ahead. Sleep came in short pieces. In one of them, Nora stood at the end of the dock with her paint shirt rolled to the elbows, tapping the board twice with her brush, like always. In the dream, I kept trying to warn her about the pull under the pilings, and she kept smiling at the west sky like she had not heard me. I woke before dawn with my jaw clenched and Scout already standing beside the bed. The next morning held to routine because routine was what I trusted. I lit the stove, set coffee to boil, and measured out Scout's feed by the same dent in the metal scoop my father had used. Frost silvered the grass by the woodshed. I split alder until my forearms burned and stacked each piece bark out under the eave. Then I went to the dock with a scrub brush, a bucket, and the same tape measure in my back pocket. The handprint had dried to a rusty brown and sunk into the grain. In daylight, it looked less like panic and more like effort, like a body taking weight through one hand to keep from going down. I crouched and studied each finger streak. The middle 2 had deeper pressure, the little finger barely marked. The smear angled from landside toward waterside, not the other way around. Whoever left it had been moving along the rail, not climbing up from the lake. I photographed it with the old digital camera Nora used for reference shots. The camera battery held 20 minutes on a good day. I took 6 images with a quarter for scale, then walked back up and plugged the memory card into my father's desktop in the corner room, where damp made the windows sweat by noon. The monitor hummed and took its time loading. I printed 2 copies on fading ink, dated them, and clipped one to my notebook page. By the last days of March, those paper records had joined weather notes and fish counts on the pantry wall, and my days narrowed to work, watch, and write. The pattern gave me a frame when grief tried to spread into every hour. Mornings were for wood, rope, nets, and stove ash. Midday was for mending and patching. Late afternoon was for the dock and light checks. Dusk was for the 2 mugs. Night was for listening to Scout breathe and naming what I could hear outside the glass. Grief did not leave because I kept busy. It changed texture. At street, Anne's grief had been noise and fluorescent light and metal carts rattling through hallways I could not cross without tasting panic. At Blackwater, it came as pressure in the chest when I reached for a second plate, as a pause at the nail where Nora's yellow raincoat used to hang, as a hand that stayed empty when I turned to pass her a brush. Some days that pressure sat heavy from waking to dark. Some days it lifted for an hour when I worked with my hands and watched the lake lie still. The cabin itself held all of it without comment. Cedar walls darkened by decades of smoke. A crooked shelf my father cut short and shimmed with folded cardboard. Nora's old paint rags washed and folded in a biscuit tin because I had not decided what else to do with them. A map of the watershed with grease pencil circles around bad spring channels. Her handwriting on the back door trim where she had marked water levels 1 flood year, each line dated, each inch fought for. Nothing in that place asked me to move on. It only asked me to keep the fire fed and the roof sound. Scout kept acting like a second set of instruments. He ate and slept and moved slow on his hips. But each evening, nearly the same minute, he rose from the rug and walked to the porch before I did. He stood at the top of the dock ramp with his ears forward and his tail low, and he faced the north cedar band as if waiting for a neighbor to step out. Not once did he charge. Not once did his bark break the quiet. On the first day of April, rain came cold and straight. I wore my father's waxed coat to check the fish pail and found 2 more trout gone under the latched lid. No torn wood, no paw marks in the soft mud beside the smokehouse. Just a faint, wet print on the plank step that looked like a bare heel, longer than my boot sole and sunk deep at the back edge. I measured that too and wrote it down. That afternoon, I did call an outside number. Cell service at the cabin came and went with weather, but the ridge above the woodshed caught 1 bar if I stood by the split cedar stack and held still. I rang County Wildlife and got a voicemail first. Then a field tech named Marla called back near supper while I was straining coffee. I kept it plain. Missing fish from a secured pail. Unusual tracks near the dock. No direct sighting. She asked for size, stride, and whether I had seen claw marks. I read from the notebook. She paused, then said, "Most likely a bear testing food sources early. Keep attractants locked up. Make noise at dusk. Call if there is property damage." I thanked her and hung up. 3 days later, she left a follow-up message after reviewing the photos I emailed from Town Library Internet. Her conclusion stayed the same. Could be partial impressions distorted by runoff. No immediate action recommended. I wrote her name and the outcome beside the date and pinned that note under the handprint photo. External report made. No response beyond caution. That same week, other small oddities stacked up in ways runoff could not explain. A bundle of nylon line I had coiled by the stern post was moved to the far end of the dock and set in a tidy loop, not tangled. Nora's old paintbrush, the wide, flat one with blue tape around the ferrule, appeared on the rail one morning after months in a jar by the sink. I had not carried it down. Wind could carry leaves and needles, not a brush laid parallel to the grain with the bristles facing west. One evening, just after the birds lifted early from the reeds, I heard 3 knocks from the north side of the cove. Not random branch pops, even spacing. Wood on wood, then quiet. It was not the bark of a deer nor the chatter of raccoon in the alder. It sat in that narrow space between known sounds where a body goes still to listen harder. Scout stood and leaned forward, but he did not make a sound. I waited with him until dark swallowed the trunks. Then I touched his shoulder, and we went in. By the second week of April, I had a page in the notebook titled Only Signs, with timestamps and weather beside each line. Missing fish under latch lid. Broad prints with heel depth. Coiled rope moved. Brush relocated. 3 knocks from North Cove. Birds rising 10 minutes early, 6 days running. I was not building a story. I was building a record because records had kept me steady in rooms where people bled and machines failed, and families needed facts, not fear. Still, curiosity had taken the chair where dread used to sit. I found myself finishing chores faster so I could be on the dock before the light flattened. I watched the reed line through binoculars my father used for winter elk counts. I noticed where the water dimpled against submerged timber and where it did not. I learned the exact minute Scout's ears tipped forward each evening. I listened for those measured knocks and heard them twice more, always from farther left along the north bank, always 3, always after the birds left. On a clear evening with a low orange sun and no wind at all, I carried the 2 enamel mugs down as usual and set Nora's untouched cup beside my knee. Scout settled on the ramp with a soft grunt. The lake surface held the sky in one unbroken sheet, and the cedar shadows stood long across the cove. I rested my hand on the rail near the dried brown print and felt the old grain under my palm, rough and familiar. Across the water, somewhere behind the reeds, something large shifted weight once and then went still. I marked the time in my notebook, closed it, and kept watching until the last light left the planks. I stayed on the dock after dark, took the far bank, listening to that one place behind the reeds where I had heard weight settle. Scout did not lie back down. He stood with his chest forward and his nose lifted, working the air in short draws. I kept my hand on the rail and let my eyes adjust. The water turned from slate to black glass. Tree trunks across the cove blurred into one long wall. Then I saw it. Not movement first. Shape. A vertical dark that did not match cedar lines, half hidden between 2 trunks near the north point where the bank rose and the ferns grew thick. I could not make out a face. I could not mark hands. But the shoulders were too broad and set too high for a man in a coat, and the height put its head above the lower branch shelf by at least 2 feet. My knees locked where I stood. My breath stopped halfway in. Scout gave one low sound and moved so his side touched my shin. He did not bark. He did not pull back. I stayed still and looked straight at that gap in the trees. The figure did not step forward. It did not crouch to hide. It held in place as if watching me watch it, quiet and deliberate. Fear came clean and fast, old animal fear that starts in the spine and runs hot through the arms. Wonder came with it, just as fast and harder to name. I had spent weeks measuring marks and making notes, so I would not make stories where there were only runoff and wind. That shape across the cove was no runoff, no shadow trick, no drifting branch. I did not call out. I did not move for the rifle by the door. Easy, I said. barely above a whisper, not sure if I meant Scout or myself. The figure shifted one step backward into deeper shade. Not a turn and run. Just one measured step, weight placed quietly, then another. In 3 breaths it was gone behind cedar trunks without so much as a snapped twig. I stood a full minute after it vanished. I counted my pulse against the dock boards. Scout kept staring at the same opening in the trees until I touched the scruff at his neck. "We go inside now," I said. He turned with me at once, slow but steady up the ramp. Inside the cabin, I latched the door and lit the table lamp low. My hands shook when I opened the notebook. I wrote time, weather, light conditions, location, estimated height against branch line. I drew a rough map of the north bank and marked the tree gap with an X. Then I sat with both palms flat on the table until the shaking eased. The stove clicked and sighed as the alder caught. Scout drank from his bowl, then came back and pressed his muzzle into my knee before lying down on the rug. I slept in short blocks and woke before dawn. Rain had not come. Wind stayed flat from the west. I made coffee, fed Scout, and walked out with the camera while the light was still grey. Across the cove, through binoculars, I could not find a clear track line on that bank from distance. The ground there held cedar duff over roots and gave little away. I took photos of the tree gap anyway, each frame dated, and wrote the compass direction from my father's old field compass. By late morning, I drove to town for feed and lamp oil. At the marina supply counter, Pete Harmon asked if I was settling in all right, back up at Blackwater. I told him yes. He said the spring pull was running strong this year and pointed at a bulletin tacked by the register. "Keep clear of outer pilings after rain surge." He tapped the paper twice with one finger and said, "Water does not care how long you have lived here." "I know," I said. I did not mention the figure in the cedars. I did not mention the handprint. Back at the cabin, I worked through the afternoon with my ears tuned to the lake. I patched a split net float, tightened the rowboat's stern knot, and scraped moss from the middle planks where water sat after rain. Scout followed each task at his own pace and rested in the shade when his hips stiffened. He looked up toward the north trees more than once, then settled again. That evening, I carried the 2 mugs down before the birds lifted. The sky stayed clear, pale gold over the ridge. I sat at mid-dock and kept my hands visible on my knees. Scout lay on the ramp, head up. At the same minute as the night before, coots and teal rose from the far reeds and crossed west in a tight line. 10 heartbeats later, that same dark shape took form between trunks at the north point. Farther left this time. Still partially screened. Still upright. I froze again, but not from surprise alone. There was a quality to its stillness that did not read as stalking. It read as waiting. The figure remained for less than a minute. Then it stepped back and disappeared as before, quiet and controlled. No rush, no bluff, no sound. The pattern held the next evening and the next. By the 4th sighting, I knew the place my body would lock and the place it would soften. Fear stayed. So did the pull to remain seated and witness what was there, instead of forcing it into an answer I already had. 3 days after the first clear glimpse, I changed one small thing. Before dusk, I went to the smokehouse, chose a strip of smoked trout, and set it on the end post of the dock, where weather had silvered the cedar smooth. I kept my movements plain. No sudden reach, no stepping to the rail to peer across. When I finished, I walked back to the porch with Scout and sat on the top step where I could see the post and the north tree gap together. Scout leaned against my thigh and watched with me. "Just watching," I told him. The birds lifted, light flattened. Nothing moved for several minutes. Then, across the cove, the figure appeared between trunks, paused, and held. It did not come out into open shoreline. It did not approach the water. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. We stayed like that until dark settled enough that I could no longer separate trunk from shadow. I brought Scout in and left the fish where it was overnight. At first light, I walked down with a flashlight and found the post empty. No scattered flakes, no claw gouges, no drag marks on the plank. In place of the trout lay two thin willow twigs, crossed neatly at the center, angles nearly even as if set by careful fingers. I crouched and stared at them for a long moment before I touched anything. Then I photographed the twigs from 3 angles with a quarter beside them, noted the time, and lifted them into a clean zip bag. I labelled the bag and set it in the bread tin with the earlier cloth sample. That evening, I repeated the same act. 1 smoked trout on the end post, retreat to the porch, Scout at my side. The figure appeared a little sooner, still half obscured. It stayed longer than before. I could make out the slope of head and neck now, and 1 forearm when it shifted weight against a trunk. Hair looked dark and matted in shoulder clumps, not fur smooth like bear. Proportions still wrong for any person I had known in those woods. It did not come forward. It did not leave while I watched. In the morning, the trout was gone again. On the same post sat 3 lake stones stacked from largest to smallest, balanced with the flat faces aligned toward the cabin. I ran a finger over each stone. Damp, clean, no mud pressed into cracks. Carried from shore, not kicked up by wave. By the 2nd week of April, the exchange had become part of my dusk routine, as fixed as coffee and stove ash. Split wood, feed Scout, check rope, note wind, place fish, step back. Some evenings I stayed on the porch. Some evenings, after the figure showed itself, I walked down and sat halfway out on the dock with my hands in my lap. It remained across the cove, watching. The distance held. Scout changed with it. The low growl that had lived in his chest at first gave way to quiet huffs and long listening. Once, when the figure shifted from one trunk gap to another, Scout rose to his feet, then settled without my touch. That told me more than any print. One evening, rain passed just before dusk and left the planks wet and shining. I had forgotten Nora's wide, flat paintbrush on the rail after cleaning old jars in the shed. I left trout on the post and went back to the porch with a blanket over my knees. Scout rested his chin on my boot. The figure appeared late, almost at full dark. For one brief interval, it stepped clear enough that I saw the full torso profile against pale water behind the reeds. Massive chest, long arms. Head set forward slightly, as if scenting wind. It stood there in open view for maybe 5 seconds. Then it turned sideways and moved back into cedar shadow without haste. In the morning, the trout was gone. On the rail beside Nora's brush lay a single heron feather, long and slate grey, placed parallel to the brush handle with the quill pointed west. I did not move right away. I looked from feather to brush and back, and my throat tightened in that old familiar way. Nora had painted herons every spring because, she said, they looked like old men thinking hard. She had one half-finished canvas still wrapped in cloth in the loft. I sat on the dockboard and let the feeling run through instead of pushing it down. Scout came and stood over my shoulder, breathing warm against my neck. "It saw," I said to him, voice rough. "It saw what mattered." He licked once at the back of my hand and looked toward the trees. I left the feather and brush where they were until sunset. When I carried the 2 mugs out, I set Nora's cup on my left, as always, and sat farther down the planks than before, only a few boards short of the end post. Scout settled between me and the ramp. Across the cove, the figure appeared in its usual gap. It stayed longer than any previous evening, then shifted to another opening closer to the waterline. Still no threat display, no charge, no thrown branch, just presence, steady and attentive. I raised my empty hand slowly, palm out, then rested it back on my knee. The figure did not mirror the gesture. It did not retreat. We held that distance until the lake lost its color and became one sheet of dark metal under the first stars. When I stood to go in, the figure stepped back once and vanished into the cedar band, as if honoring the same endpoint each night. By the time the moon rose above the ridge, the feather still lay on the rail beside Nora's brush, and the dock no longer felt like a place claimed only by absence. By the time I banked the stove and checked the door latch, rain had started on the roof in a fine, steady line. Scout stayed awake on the rug with his head up, listening between drops. I sat at the table with my notebook open but did not write. The heron feather and Nora's brush lay side by side on the counter where I could see them from my chair. Near midnight, 3 knocks carried across the water. Not branch noise, not loose siding. Even, wooden, spaced by a breath. I stood before I knew I had moved. Scout was already at the door, weight forward, tail low. I opened the door to cold rain and darkness. The dockboards shone slick under the porch light. Beyond the lamp's reach, along the north cove, a larger shadow shifted between trunks. It stepped into a narrow gap where I could see its shoulders, then stepped back, then forward again. The motion was not a threat display. It was paced and repeated, like a signal given to someone slow to understand. I pulled on my waxed coat and took the flashlight from the nail by the jamb. "Stay with me," I said. Scout came down the porch steps at my knee. The figure moved left along the bank, stopped, and looked back toward me. Then it moved again, faster this time, pausing every few yards to turn and check that I was still there. Rain thickened and ran from my hood brim in steady streams. I crossed the lower yard, boots sinking in moss and soft earth, and cut toward the old service path that led to the outer pilings. That path had not mattered since my father stopped storing lumber by the waterline. Alder saplings had come up through the edges. Ferns crowded the ditch. I kept my beam low and watched for roots. Scout kept close, shoulder brushing my calf when the ground tilted. The figure stayed ahead of us, never more than 30 yards out. Twice, it gave a short, chest-deep sound, not loud, more like forced air pushed through clenched throat. Urgent. It did not wait long when I slowed. It moved back toward me, then turned again toward the water and paced. Spring runoff had raised Blackwater 2 hand widths against the dock posts, and tonight the pull sounded stronger under every board. When we reached the outer section, my light caught the break first. The last span of planks had split from the main dock and dipped at an angle, one corner still held by bolts, the other riding low and slapping at the current. Water surged through the gap in black folds. The old, rusted cable my father once used for winter mooring had worked loose from a submerged cleat and twisted into the pilings below. Something large thrashed once in that tangle and struck wood hard enough to shake the broken span. I swung the beam down and saw him, younger than the watcher across the cove, but still heavy through chest and shoulder, dark hair plastered to skin by rain and lake water. One leg was pinned between cable loops and a submerged cross brace. Each surge rolled him deeper, then slammed him against the post. He tried to brace with both arms, slipped and surfaced again with a short, raw gasp. My body went cold in one rush. The older one stood on shore to my right, 2 strides from the edge, leaning forward with both hands open and low. Its eyes moved from the trapped limb to my face, then to the rope coil hanging on the broken rail beside me. Back to my face, back to the rope. It was asking. I did not think about species. I did not think about what town people would call this if I brought them here. I saw a body in moving water and a limb taking load against steel. That was enough. I set the flashlight between two planks so the beam held on the snag. I stripped the rope coil free and tied a bowline around my waist with wet fingers that fumbled once before memory took over. I fed the running end toward shore and pointed at a cedar stump rooted above the wash line. "Hold here," I said, voice hard from the rain. The older one stepped in, took the rope in both hands, and wrapped it once around the stump without taking its eyes off me. Its grip set, elbows bent, feet planted in mud and root. Scout whined and pawed the edge of the broken plank. "Back," I told him. "Stay." He backed 2 steps and crouched, trembling but steady. I clipped my river pliers to my belt, dropped to one knee, and tested the first board with my weight. It dipped and shuddered but held. Current roared under the split span and threw spray into my face. I moved out another board, then another, keeping low. One hand on the rail stub, one hand on the rope at my waist. The trapped one saw me and lunged hard. Cable bit deeper and stopped him. He made that same forced air sound, shorter now, then held still with effort that shook through his whole frame. "It is okay," I said, barely above rain. "Hold still." I do not know if the words mattered. My tone did. He stopped pulling. I slid into the water on my stomach and let the rope take half my weight. Cold hit like impact. My breath snapped short. Current shoved my legs downstream at once, then tried to roll me under the broken edge. The line at my waist went tight. The older one took the load and held. I got one arm around the piling and found the cable with my left hand. Old steel strands, thick with rust, twisted twice through the brace and looped over the trapped calf. Not clean cable anymore. Frayed wire ends stood out like needles and caught skin each time the water surged. I wedged the plier jaws into the first frayed section and squeezed. Nothing. Shifted grip. Squeezed again with both hands while current hammered my shoulder into wood. The strand gave with a sharp pop that vibrated through my wrists. One down. The trapped one kicked by reflex and almost drove me off the piling. I pressed my forearm to the brace and shouted without looking up, "Hold him!" The older one moved into the edge wash until water hit its knees, one hand still on my line, the other reaching down to the younger's shoulder. It did not yank. It settled weight and steadied him against the post, taking the surge through its own frame. I cut a second strand, then a third. The loop loosened around the calf but still held at the underside where I could not see. I ducked once under the surface, eyes open into black grit and bubbles, and felt for the hidden wrap with my fingers. Found it by touch where it crossed a bolt head, brought the pliers around blind, clamped, pulled. The tool slipped. Wire tore my glove and sliced the heel of my hand. Heat flashed, then vanished in cold water. I reset and pulled again, bracing one boot against the post. This time the final wrap snapped. "Now!" I gasped. The older one heaved backward on my rope and the younger's shoulder together. I pushed from below. The trapped leg came free in one violent surge that rolled all 3 of us. Water took me sideways and slammed me into the broken plank. The line at my waist caught and dragged me clear before I went under the span. I crawled onto the tilted boards and lay there 2 breaths, coughing lake water and rain. Scout barked once, sharp and scared, then fell silent. The younger one had collapsed half on the broken section, half in the wash. The freed leg bent wrong at first glance, then settled into alignment when he shifted. A deep cable groove circled the lower calf, packed with rust, silt, and shredded hair. No spurting, no major bleed, but tissue was torn and swollen fast in the cold. I hauled myself to my knees. "Up," I said, not to anyone in particular. The older one released the line, moved onto the planks with careful weight, and slid both arms under the younger's chest from behind. I grabbed under the opposite arm, and together we dragged him by inches toward the stable section. Each surge tried to pull him back. Each time the older one leaned and took it. When we reached dry boards near the ramp, I cut my waistline free and checked Scout with one glance. He was pressed flat to the planks, ears back, but he did not run. He crawled forward and sniffed the younger's shoulder once, then sat beside my boot like he had chosen a side. Rain eased to a fine mist. My hands shook from cold and adrenaline. Work remained. I got the younger fully onto the dock and rolled him to his side to protect his airway if he vomited water. He coughed twice and drew a deeper breath. Good. I touched the leg again, quick assessment by habit. Warm above the groove. Cooler below, but capillary return still present at nail beds. No obvious open fracture. Severe constriction trauma and contamination. I pointed to the cabin and then to the younger's leg. I need hot water, salve, cloth. The older one watched my hand, then my face. It nodded once, a small downward motion, and stayed where it was, one broad hand resting on the younger's upper back to keep him grounded. I ran with Scout to the cabin, boots slapping wet boards. Inside, I moved by muscle memory. Kettle filled and set hard on stove. Clean pot. Iodine packet from the old field kit. Pine salve jar. 2 rolls of gauze. Flannel shirt from the hook by the door. Trauma shears. I grabbed the lantern too and headed back before the water boiled, then returned for the kettle when steam rose. The next hour narrowed to tasks. Lantern hung from the rail. Kettle tipped into pot to cool to safe heat. I cleaned the groove in passes, flushing rust and grit, while the younger flinched and tensed. The older held his shoulders with steady pressure and never interfered. Scout lay near my left hip, rigid and watchful, head low. I spoke only when needed. Still. Easy. One more pass. When the wound bed ran clear enough, I patted dry with sterile pads, spread pine salve along the torn edges to protect against cold and surface contamination, and wrapped with flannel first, for padding. Then gauze over that, snug but not strangling. I checked distal warmth again. Better than before. To keep swelling down, I elevated the leg on a coil of rope and a folded life jacket. The younger shivered in waves that lifted his shoulders off the boards. Hypothermia was the next risk. I stripped my wet coat, spread a wool blanket from the emergency locker over his torso, and set a second blanket across hips and uninjured leg. The older leaned close and added its own body heat without crowding the wound site, chest near the younger's back. One forearm draped across the blanket edge to hold it against wind. Rain stopped. Fog drifted low over Blackwater and caught the lantern light in pale bands. I sat back on my heels, palms on my thighs, and listened to breathing. Scout's slow huff. The younger's rough inhale smoothing toward rhythm. The older's deep, controlled breaths timed to each movement under the blanket. No one spoke. Nothing in that hour required language. When the younger finally lifted his head on his own and focused, he looked first at the older one, then at me. His eyes held there long enough for me to see he was fully present. Not wild, not panicked, exhausted, hurting, and aware. I touched the wrapped leg once more, checked the knot, and nodded. The older one met my eyes across the lantern glow and lowered its head by a fraction, a gesture so small I could have missed it if I had blinked. Then it set 2 knuckles gently on the dockboard between us and held them there until the younger's breathing steadied into sleep. I looked at those two knuckles on the wet cedar and felt a clean line run through me from present to past. Nora used to tap twice with the butt of her brush before she went inside, always at day's end, always in the same place near the middle seam. This was not that. It was heavier, broader, and deliberate in a different way. But it carried the same plain meaning. I was here. You were here. We both knew what happened on these boards. I set my own hand down where his knuckles rested, not over them, just beside, and pressed my fingertips to the grain. I understand, I said, voice low enough that it stayed between us. He did not move right away. Lantern light caught the wet lines in his hair and the deep set of his brow. When he finally lifted his hand, he kept his eyes on mine. They were dark, steady, and clear. Not wild, not angry, just knowing. I had seen frightened eyes on patients in trauma rooms, seen confused eyes in late dementia, seen pain pull people away from themselves. His gaze held none of that scattered panic. It held attention. It held memory. It held the weight of a choice made and recognized. The younger one stirred under the blankets and made a strained sound through his nose. The older one shifted at once, one hand returning to the younger's shoulder, thumb spread wide to keep him from rolling onto the wrapped leg. I checked the dressing again and slid 2 fingers under the top edge. Warmth was holding. Swelling was still climbing, but slower than before. "You stay off that leg," I said, speaking to the younger one, though I did not know if he could pass the words. "No weight yet." He blinked hard and focused on my face. Then he looked down at the flannel wrap, touched it with the back of his fingers, and stilled. He understood enough. Scout inched forward on stiff elbows and laid his chin on my boot. His ears were still back, but his body had gone soft from rigid alert to tired watch. I scratched behind his shoulder without taking my eyes off the pair in front of me. "Good boy," I said. "You did right." Fog thickened over the lake and thinned again in slow breaths. Somewhere up the slope, water dripped from cedar boughs in a patient rhythm. No birds called yet. The whole cove held that pre-dawn quiet where every small sound seems placed by hand. I rose carefully, knees aching from the dockboards, and went up to the cabin for more hot water. The stove had burned down to deep orange coals. I fed it 2 split alder lengths, set the kettle back on, and stood with both palms on the counter while steam started to lift. My hands had stopped shaking. The cut in my glove had marked the heel of my palm, shallow and stinging now that warmth returned. I rinsed it, wrapped it in gauze, and carried the kettle and a second wool blanket back through the mist. When I stepped onto the dock, the older one looked up but did not flinch. I poured warm water into the enamel basin and knelt beside the younger's leg again, loosening the outer gauze just enough to check skin tone at the edges. Better color than an hour ago. I replaced the wrap and tucked the blanket tighter around his hips. The older one watched each motion and then copied one of them, pulling the blanket corner down over exposed flank with precise care. I nodded once. "Yes, keep him warm." For a long stretch, none of us moved much. The younger drifted in and out, breathing rough then smoother. The older stayed half-curled around him, an anchored shape against wind and cold. Scout slept in short drops and lifts, head rising whenever the younger shifted, then lowering again when he settled. I sat with my back against the post where the rail had split and counted breaths, because counting kept me present. By first grey light, the rain had fully stopped. Blackwater changed colour in front of us, from ink to steel to a flat, pale sheet that reflected cloud breaks near the eastern ridge. The younger woke deeper this time and pushed to his elbows. Pain hit his face at once when he moved the injured leg. He bared his teeth on a breath, then held still. "Easy," I said, slow. The older one helped him sit without lifting the wrapped calf off its support. They moved with practiced coordination, small shifts of shoulder and forearm that told me this was not the first injury tended in a hard place. When the younger was upright, he looked at me again. Then he placed his hand briefly over the bandage, pressed once, and tapped the dockboard with 2 fingers, before drawing his hand back. Not mimicry, intentional return. My throat tightened. I answered with the same 2-finger tap on the cedar between us. The older one stood first and tested the broken section with 1 foot before committing weight. Then he crouched and offered his forearm to the younger, who pulled himself up in stages, keeping the wrapped leg mostly clear. I moved in automatically to brace from the other side, 1 hand at the younger's elbow, 1 at his back. His hair smelled like wet bark and lake silt. His skin ran hot with stress over deep cold. He leaned into both of us and found balance. We got him up the ramp 1 measured step at a time. At the top of the yard, just short of the first cedar line, both stopped and turned toward the lake as if hearing something beyond my range. Scout stood beside me, tail low, no growl. The older lifted his chin slightly toward the far shore. I followed his gaze. Across Blackwater, in the trees opposite my dock, figures resolved 1 by 1 from shadow to form. 6 of them, tall, broad, and still among the cedars, spaced with deliberate distance between each body. They did not hide. They did not advance. They stood where I could see them fully in the morning light. No one made a sound. A minute can stretch when it is full. That one did. I saw variation in height, 1 narrower through the shoulders, 1 with lighter patches along the forearm, 1 older by posture with a deeper forward set at the neck. Family, not a loose group. They held their ground and watched the 3 of us on my bank, me with wet pants and a bandaged hand, Scout braced against my leg, and the 2 from the dock with 1 injured and wrapped in my flannel. The older one beside me touched the younger's upper arm and began to move toward the trees. The younger limped but stayed upright, favoring the injured side exactly as I had hoped he would. Before the older stepped fully into cedar shadow, he looked back once. Our eyes met again. That same direct recognition sat there, unforced and complete. Then they were gone into timber. Across the lake, the 6 turned almost as one and withdrew in single file between the trunks until only branches moved, and then those stilled too. I stood in the yard until the cold found me through wet clothes. Scout leaned into my thigh and gave 1 soft huff. I put my hand on his neck and felt his pulse, slow and steady now. "Come on," I said. "We warm up." Inside, I stripped at the door, toweled Scout dry, and wrapped myself in 2 blankets near the stove while coffee reheated. I wrote everything down before sleep could blur edges. Time of departure, number observed, placement across the cove, condition of injured leg on ambulation, behavior calm and coordinated, no aggression. I added 1 line beneath the clinical details because leaving it out would have been dishonest. Mutual acknowledgement clear. By late afternoon, the sky had opened into thin blue and moving white. I went back to the dock with a pry bar, spare bolts, and a brace plank cut from the old lumber stack. Practical work first. I shored the broken section enough to hold my weight and marked the outer edge with red cloth strips so I would not misstep at dusk. The rusted cable lay in a heap where I had cut it free. I coiled each piece, measured approximate length, and hauled it to the shed to keep it from finding another ankle. Evidence handled, hazard removed. I did place 1 call before sunset. From the ridge by the woodshed, I reached county maintenance and reported storm damage to private dock pilings, plus submerged scrap cable hazard near the outer span. The clerk logged it, gave me a case number, and said they could send a waterways inspector sometime the following week, if access held. I wrote the number in my notebook and underlined it. Call made. Outcome pending. That evening, I carried 2 enamel mugs down, as always. My body ached in new places. My cut hand throbbed under fresh gauze. Scout moved slower than usual, but chose the dock over the rug without hesitation. I set Nora's untouched cup on my left and sat halfway out where the repaired boards began. The lake birds lifted from the far reeds 10 minutes early, same as before. I waited through the first dimming of light and listened to water move under the patched span. The undertow was still there, still cold, still stronger than it looked. It had not changed its nature. What changed was what sat beside it now in my memory. Rope under tension, hands on line, shared weight against current. No one taken. When the sky went from pale steel to pewter, he stepped out from the north trees and came to the far end of the dock. He did not stop at the bank this time. He crossed the planks with careful placement around the repaired break and lowered himself to sit where Nora used to paint cloud edges, broad shoulders angled toward open water. Scout watched, sniffed the damp air once, and lay down between us with a long exhale. I did not speak. He did not either. We sat through the rest of sunset in clean silence, the 3 of us facing Blackwater, as the ripples widened and flattened, and the first evening star came on above the ridge. He sat until the light failed and the lake turned to one dark plate under the stars. When I rose, he rose. Scout stood too, stiff in the hips, and shook water from his coat. At the top of the ramp, I stopped and looked back once. The visitor touched 2 knuckles to the end board, then stepped off the dock and disappeared into the cedar line without a broken branch or a splash. Inside, I wrote the time beside his first approach onto the planks. I added 1 line under it. Sat at far end calm. No threat display. Departed on my stand. Then I opened the bread tin and laid the new page on top of the bagged rag and the crossed willow twigs. I did not throw any of it away. I did not call anyone in the night. 3 days passed before County Waterways came up my drive in a white truck with mud to the wheel wells. The inspector was a woman named Denise, with a yellow rain shell and a clipboard wrapped in plastic. She walked the dock with me, crouched by the patched span, and looked at the cut cable coils I had stacked by the shed. "You did the right thing pulling this scrap out," she said. "This line could take a leg clean off if someone hits it under load." She measured bolt spacing, checked the submerged brace with a pole, and tagged my temporary repair as passable for 1 season. She gave me a form with a case number that matched the one in my notebook and wrote hazard removed by owner. No further county action required unless span fails. I asked if she wanted the cable pieces. She shook her head. "Private material. Keep or scrap at transfer station." I carried the coils to town that Friday and watched the yardman toss them into the steel bin. The clang rang off the concrete walls and settled something in me I had not named. That same afternoon, while I sat in the library lot sending invoices for per diem nursing shifts I had started taking in town, my phone lit with Marla from Wildlife. I stepped outside for signal and answered. "You reported unusual prints and missing fish," she said. "Any more property damage?" "No damage now," I told her. "Dock issue was handled. Fish loss stopped." "Any direct bear sightings?" I looked at the trees beyond the parking lot and kept my voice even. "No confirmed bear." She paused, pen tapping. "All right, I will close the file as inconclusive activity. Call again if there is escalation." "I will," I said. That was the whole outcome. She never came to the cabin. She never asked a second time what I thought I had seen. By the second week of May, I had moved the evidence from the bread tin to my father's old metal deed box in the loft where damp stayed low. I labelled each bag and envelope in block letters the way I used to label wound photos at work. Rail sample 3/17. Willow cross 4/6. Handprint photographs with scale. Feather placement photo. Track measurements and weather notes. Wildlife callback log. Waterways closure form. I added one page at the front that said, stored for record. Not submitted. On that same page I added, March rail blood handprint, most likely from the younger one, bleeding and bracing along the top rail before the cable entrapment at outer span. Thread resolved. The evenings built their own rhythm after that. I split Alder, checked the rowboat knot, fed Scout, and set 2 mugs on the dock. He came most nights at the same minute the birds rose from the reeds. He always used the same path between the north cedars and the low stump by shore. He always sat at the far end, shoulders toward open water, hands resting on his knees or flat on the boards. We did not touch. We did not make a show of trust. We held it by repetition. One clear night in June, I left smoked trout on the end post and sat back by the middle seam with Nora's cup cooling at my left hand. Scout slept between us, chin on paws, one ear flicking at insects. The visitor rose before full dark, walked to the post, took the fish, and set down a small bundle of cattail leaves braided into a ring no wider than my palm. He placed it beside Nora's untouched mug and returned to his place without looking at me for permission. I lifted the ring when he left. It smelled like mud, clean water, and crushed green stem. By late July, I understood some of the earlier strange things in a plain way. The 3 knocks had been a signal, not random sound. The moved rope coil had been selection, not mischief. The birds left early because they tracked his route before I could. The brush moved to the rail because he had seen me hold it and set it down there with care. I could not prove any of that on paper. Still, the pattern fit the facts better than anything else I had. Scout changed as the summer heat came on. His legs stiffened after long walks, and he chose the shade sooner. On evenings when his hips hurt, he stayed on the porch and watched us from the top step. The visitor looked toward him each time before sitting, as if taking attendance. Once, in August, Scout did not come down at all. He had a fever and a belly that would not settle, and I stayed inside sponging his paws and coaxing water by spoon. At dusk, 3 soft knocks came from the North Cove. I stepped onto the porch in my socks and saw the visitor standing at the tree line, not approaching, not leaving. I raised a hand and pointed back toward the cabin where Scout lay. "Not tonight," I said. "He is sick." The visitor held still for several breaths, then lowered his head and withdrew into the dark. The next evening, after Scout ate and kept it down, the visitor returned to the dock at the usual hour and set a cluster of huckleberries on the rail before he sat. Scout sniffed them, sneezed once, and ate 2 from my palm. By the first week of September, the understory went dry and loud underfoot. I started 1 hospital shift a week at the small clinic in town, mostly wound checks and med passes, just enough to keep my license active and my hands useful. I drove out before dawn and drove back before dusk because I would not miss the dock hour. Pete saw me at the marina pump one evening and asked if the dock repair had held. "It held," I said. He looked past me toward the ridge and nodded. "Good. Water still pulls hard near those old pilings." He had given me that warning in spring and never finished the sentence after it. He never told me what he thought might be out there. I never asked, and he never offered. The air turned sharp by early October. Fog sat lower each morning, and the maples above the shed dropped yellow leaves onto the roof in wet clumps. One evening I carried the mugs down and found the end post empty. No fish taken because I had not left any. No tracks on the dry boards except mine. He came late, just at the edge of dark, sat for 10 minutes, then left without the knuckle tap. It was the first time he had done that. The next evening, he did not come. I sat through full dusk anyway. Scout slept by the stove and did not follow me out. The reeds hissed, birds crossed west, and the north bank stayed still. On the third evening, the sky cleared after a hard noon wind, and the lake took on that deep blue-black colour Nora used to chase with too much ultramarine on her brush. I carried 2 mugs as always. At the rail where the old handprint had long since weathered out of sight, something waited. A careful cross of driftwood lay centred on the top board, each piece matched for length and cleaned of bark. Under it, bound with marsh grass in 3 tight wraps, was Nora's weathered paintbrush, the wide flat one with blue tape at the ferrule. The bristles had been washed and combed straight, no mud in the tape seam, no broken hairs. I set my mug down and touched the grass wrap with one finger. It was still damp from the reeds. "Thank you," I said to the empty tree line. No answer came except water under the pilings and one kingfisher call upstream. I did not wait inside for him after that. I waited on the dock each evening through the first hard frost, then through the week after. He did not return. The birds still lifted early some nights, but no tall shape crossed the north opening. No knocks sounded from Cedar Shadow. The place kept his absence the way it had once kept Nora's, with no explanation and no apology. On the last clear evening before winter rain set in, I carried 1 mug to the dock and set the driftwood cross and Nora's brush on the rail beside me. Scout slept inside by the stove, too stiff to manage wet planks after dark. I sat at the middle seam where my sister used to tap twice, and I watched ripples widen from the old pilings and flatten into calm. And for the first time since she died, the ache in my chest fit inside my own body instead of filling the whole lake.